The auditorium went silent as Isaiah stepped forward, the only black boy on the roster. From the back row, Landon laughed loud enough for everyone to hear. Did he wander in off the street? The judges didn't say a word. No one did. Isaiah looked down at his shoes, then up at the spotlight. He hadn't even sung yet, but the war had already begun. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The clock on the faded cream wall ticked steadily toward 9 p.m., but no one dared move. The air inside the Westbridge Community Theater buzzed with quiet competition, the kind that seeped through the floorboards and curled under every folding chair. The stage, modest and raised only a foot above the worn carpet, seemed larger in the eyes of the hopeful teenagers seated across the room. This wasn't Broadway, but to them it was close enough. Every kid in the room carried a dream sharpened by years of private coaches, voice lessons and polished performances at local galas. Every kid except one. Near the rear, sitting slightly hunched and trying not to draw attention, was Isaiah McClendon, 13 years old, dressed in a soaked gray hoodie that clung to his arms. Isaiah was the only black face in a room full of confident white performers. He wasn't just out of place, he was invisible until they chose to notice him. And when they did, it was with confusion, curiosity, or quiet contempt. His name sat at the bottom of the audition list, a name no one in that room recognized. And yet everyone had now read it, some whispering it to themselves just to test how it sounded. Isaiah McClendon, like a typo. Isaiah's fingers trembled as he clutched the smudged paper in his lap. Lyrics he'd written out by hand. The corners were torn from being folded too many times. He'd kept it dry by tucking it inside his hoodie on the way here. Walking 6 blocks after 2 delayed buses, arriving 10 minutes before the doors were supposed to close. He hadn't even had dinner. His mother had left him a sandwich before she rushed to her double shift at the nursing home. But nerves had taken his appetite. All he carried now was his voice and a promise whispered into his ear. That morning when she kissed his forehead, a promise to make them feel him. Around him, kids chatted and adjusted their wardrobes, flipping through sheet music and humming to themselves with perfect tone. Most were dressed in pressed slacks or cheek blazers, shoes that squeaked clean across the floor. Isaiah's sneakers were separating at the toes. No one had offered him a smile. No one had spoken a word. At the front of the room sat 3 judges with weary expressions, flipping through evaluation forms and sipping lukewarm coffee. Next to them stood a woman with a clipboard, calling names one by one. Most of the performers got nods and polite applause after their turn. A few got compliments. One girl even got a handshake. With each performance, the energy in the room tilted, not toward excitement, but ownership. These were the kids who belonged. These were the ones expected to succeed. And still, Isaiah waited. When the 12th name was called, Isaiah knew he was next. His stomach twisted, unsure if it was hunger or fear. He thought about the music teacher back at school who told him auditions like these weren't for his kind. Not in those words, of course, but the message was clear when she handed him a brochure for a trades program instead. Still, he had come, not because he believed he could win, but because he needed to prove to himself that his voice was real, that it mattered, even in rooms built to ignore it. At last, the room quieted. The clipboard woman looked down at the final name and called it Isaiah McClendon. It was as if a ripple spread through the chairs. Every head turned. Conversations stopped. The silence was sharp. Some faces showed confusion, others curiosity, and a few, including one near the back of the room, displayed open annoyance. Isaiah stood slowly. His hoodie clung to his damp arms as he walked toward the stage. The steps felt longer than they were. He could feel every pair of eyes tracing his movements, judging his clothes, his silence, his skin. No one said anything out loud. They didn't need to. The judgment was already hanging in the room. From the rear corner, Landon Whitmore leaned forward, watching him with narrowed eyes. Landon was the golden boy of Westbridge. Tall, smug, always performing, even when off stage. His family name was etched into the building's donor plaque outside. His mother sat proudly near the judges, flipping through a glossy folder of his headshots. Landon had sung earlier that evening, drawing loud applause. He was used to attention. He hated sharing it. As Isaiah approached the small piano to hand the accompanist his song choice, Landon muttered something low to his friend, loud enough to carry a jab, a public insult wrapped in casual cruelty. Laughter followed, quiet and sharp, like the kind you hear behind your back in a crowded hallway. Isaiah kept walking. His hand shook slightly as he gave the pianist his sheet. The man took it without a word, eyes flicking up for just a second, before returning to the keys. Isaiah adjusted the microphone, which was set too high. He didn't ask for help, he just moved it down himself, careful not to show how nervous he felt. He stood still. For a long silent second, no one moved. The pianist placed his fingers on the keys. 3 soft chords rang out. The intro to the song Isaiah had practiced 100 times in his bedroom when the neighbors weren't home. Each note opened a door inside him. His throat tightened. His palms were slick with sweat. The sound of the piano echoed too loud in the stillness. Then, just as Isaiah opened his mouth to sing, the moment cracked. A chair scraped loudly across the floor in the back of the room. The noise was sudden, deliberate, and then, a laugh. Not just a chuckle, but a mocking, exaggerated burst of amusement that tore through the silence like glass shattering. It was Landon. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The sound was enough. His face said the rest, twisted in smug disbelief, head tilted, eyes dancing with the thrill of humiliation. A few others snickered. The pianist stopped. The clipboard woman looked up sharply. The judges didn't move. Isaiah stood frozen. His heart raced. His fingers clenched. And for one brief second, he considered turning around and walking off that stage. But then, from somewhere deep in his memory, he heard the whisper again. His mother's voice. Not afraid. Not apologetic. Just steady and sure. Make them feel you. Isaiah's lips parted. But before he could sing a single note, Landon leaned back in his chair and whispered something again, this time louder than before. The words didn't need to be heard to be felt. And that's when Isaiah saw the phone. Someone in the corner had raised it, already recording. Eyes on him, waiting. The moment had become bigger than the room, and Isaiah had no idea what was about to happen next. Isaiah's feet stayed planted. The soft piano chords still hung in the air, unfinished, suspended like a question no one wanted to answer. He could feel the silence folding in around him, tighter than the hoodie clinging to his arms. The laugh, Landon's cruel, calculated outburst, was still echoing off the walls. Not a single adult had corrected him. Not one judge had raised an eyebrow. It was as if the room had silently agreed. This wasn't Isaiah's stage. He was just visiting it, temporarily, and against better judgment. Landon sat smug in the back, arms crossed like a king surveying his court. He wasn't just some rich kid who thought he was better. He had spent his entire life being told he was son of Marshall Whitmore, the man whose face was plastered on billboards downtown, and whose signature was on half the property leases in Westbridge. Landon carried that name like armor. He was used to power, used to praise, and allergic to sharing the spotlight. Isaiah's presence here, on this stage, it wasn't just unfamiliar, it was offensive. As the pianist glanced up, unsure whether to keep playing or stop altogether, Isaiah forced his shoulders to rise just slightly. It wasn't confidence, not quite, but it was resistance, a refusal to crumble under the gaze that had been taught to doubt him. Every instinct told him to run, to escape the heat of those stares, to avoid becoming the punchline of a night that wasn't made for him. But deeper than that fear was something heavier, a bruised, quiet defiance that had grown inside him over years of being underestimated, overlooked, misnamed, and dismissed. He gripped the mic, and although his fingers trembled, his eyes stayed fixed forward. That's when it happened again. Landon leaned over to his friend beside him, not bothering to whisper quietly this time. His voice sliced through the silence, clean and sharp. Bet he cracks before the first note. A ripple of snickering followed. Some kids smirked behind their hands. One girl twisted her mouth to hold back a laugh and failed. Isaiah felt the heat rise up his neck, not just from humiliation, but from the friction of being reduced, again, to something fragile, breakable, beneath them. They weren't just mocking his singing, they were mocking the idea that someone like him could belong here at all. The judges didn't flinch. One of them even smirked. The pianist's hands hovered over the keys, waiting for the cue. Isaiah didn't move. And then, without a word, he nodded once, slow and steady. The piano resumed. But as the first bars of the intro returned, softer now, almost apologetic, Isaiah's mind spun, racing through every time he'd been warned this world wouldn't make room for him. The school counselor who gently pushed him toward janitorial work. The music teacher who said his tone was too urban. The lunch lady who always asked if he was in the wrong line when he reached for the choir tray. All those moments came rushing back, tightening around his chest like a belt pulled one notch too far. Yet something unexpected stirred inside him. Not rage, but release. He was no longer singing just for the judges, or even for himself. He was singing for every version of him that had been made to feel invisible, ridiculous, or temporary. Still, his lips hadn't moved. Not yet. Behind him, the pianist reached the bar where he knew the first verse should begin. But Isaiah stood frozen. The pause was just long enough to pull every eye closer, to make people wonder if he had forgotten the lyrics, or lost his nerve. Even the clipboard woman shifted in her seat, glancing at the clock. And just as it seemed he might not sing at all, he did something none of them expected. He closed his eyes. No performance technique, no drama, just a breath. One deep, steady breath, pulled from somewhere rooted in survival. And then, finally, he opened his mouth. But just as the first word was about to leave his lips, Landon's voice cut through the air again. Louder this time. Clearer. Wait, should I live stream this? Or would that count as charity? Gasps fluttered from a few corners of the room. This was different now. Not just a snide whisper. This was open sabotage. The pianist's hands faltered for a half-second, missing a note, unsure whether to stop. Isaiah's eyelids snapped open. He didn't speak, didn't flinch, didn't step off the stage. But his eyes, usually soft, downcast, now burned with something new. Not fury, but clarity. Like he could suddenly see the entire room for what it was. A machine designed to grind people like him down. To make them feel lucky just to be tolerated. Landon still laughed, but this time the sound rang hollow. From the back, a quiet voice muttered something. Not in defense of Isaiah, but an observation laced with tension. They're recording. Sure enough, 3 phones had been raised. And then, in a twist no one expected, especially not Landon, one of the phones wasn't pointing at Isaiah. It was pointed directly at him. The smirking, mocking rich boy. The one whose father owned buildings, but couldn't buy class. The camera had captured every word, every laugh, every loaded insult, and the video was still rolling. Landon hadn't noticed yet, but others had. One of the judges glanced toward the back, lips tightening. The pianist cleared his throat, returned his hands to the keys, and nodded toward Isaiah, silently urging him to begin. But something had shifted now. The performance hadn't even started, and already, a storm was brewing far beyond that little audition room. The power dynamic that had sat so comfortably in Landon's lap just moments ago was slowly slipping, and in its place, a dangerous tension was rising, one that couldn't be laughed away. Isaiah looked out across the room one last time, no longer searching for approval, just witnessing. And then he nodded again. The first note rang out. But what came next, no one in the room was prepared for. The final chord of the piano's intro hovered in the air like a held breath. And for a moment it felt as if the entire room froze in anticipation, or skepticism. Then, Isaiah opened his mouth and what poured out was something no one expected. His voice wasn't polished or classically trained, but it carried weight, depth, and an eerie kind of beauty, rich, almost haunting, like the kind of voice that belongs to someone who has already lived through more than he should have at 13. The first few words floated across the room like fog, soft but filled with emotion. He wasn't performing like the others had. He wasn't trying to impress with riffs or theatrics. His voice wasn't reaching out for applause. It was dragging you into something deeper, something real. The snickering had stopped. The whispers had died. Even the clatter of someone's water bottle rolling across the floor earlier felt like it belonged to a different timeline. Everyone's focus was locked on the small figure standing under that harsh fluorescent light, hoodie clinging to his arms, knuckles white around the microphone. Isaiah sang as if each line were being pulled directly from his chest, piece by piece, with quiet urgency. It wasn't just a song, it was memory. It was longing. It was a lifetime of being silenced and finally deciding to speak, even if his voice cracked doing it. And yet it didn't crack. If anything, it climbed, each verse fuller than the last, more confident, until his voice became the loudest, most undeniable thing in the room. Even the pianist, who had originally approached the song as a basic accompaniment, began adjusting to match Isaiah's emotional gravity. His fingers softened. He slowed slightly, allowing the voice to take the lead. This wasn't an audition anymore. It had transformed into a moment no one could define. Judges who had previously checked boxes and whispered feedback were now leaning forward, eyes fixed. One had set her pen down entirely. The students who'd exchanged mocking glances earlier now looked stunned, uncertain, like they were witnessing something they didn't know how to interpret. Isaiah, lost in the lyrics, still hadn't made eye contact with anyone. His gaze remained distant, focused on a corner of the room, refusing to seek validation. His only tether was the music. In the back, Landon Whitmore's face had changed. The same boy who had laughed twice before Isaiah had even sung a note, now sat eerily still. His arms were still folded, but his fingers twitched slightly against his sleeve. It wasn't embarrassment yet. It was something deeper: recognition. The realization that the control he assumed he held over the room was slipping through his fingers. He scanned the others, trying to gauge if they were still following him, still seeing the world through his lens. But no one was looking at him. All attention, all silence, all awe was drawn toward the stage. That's when the first phone came out. Trevor, one of Landon's closest allies, reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out his phone. No smirk, no snide comment. He just started recording, slowly, silently. The red circle blinked in the corner of the screen, and with it came a sense of permanence. This moment was no longer trapped in the theater. It was now alive, capable of spreading beyond these four walls. Soon 2 more phones followed, a girl in the 3rd row, a boy near the door, all filming, and none of them were pointing their cameras at Landon. Isaiah sang through the chorus with rising power, his voice swelling with emotion that couldn't be faked. His breathing was steady now. His fear had shifted into fire, every syllable hit with clarity. The pitch wasn't perfect, but it didn't matter. It wasn't about precision. It was about presence. There was something raw, almost sacred, about the way he controlled the space without demanding it. Even the smallest vocal imperfections added to the authenticity. He wasn't polished, he was real, and that reality was louder than anything Landon or his entourage had said all night. By the time Isaiah reached the bridge, his voice dipped again. This time quieter, softer, trembling on the edge of something unspoken. He didn't sing to show off. He sang like it hurt, like he'd been waiting to say these things for years. The pain wasn't dramatized, it was familiar, and that truth made it impossible to dismiss. When he closed his eyes for the final verse, a visible shiver moved through the room, as if everyone realized at once that they were part of something bigger than an audition. Landon's fingers were now clenched into fists, still tucked under his arms. He looked around again, desperate for a smirk, a laugh, anything to re-anchor him. But the crowd had turned, not against him outright, but away from him, which was somehow worse. They weren't ignoring Isaiah anymore. They were transfixed by him. Landon shifted in his seat, as if trying to physically shake the moment off his shoulders, but the spotlight wasn't his to reclaim. Then came the final note, held just long enough to echo, just long enough to make hearts pause before beating again. The kind of note that doesn't ask for applause. It just settles into the bones of those who hear it. When it ended, the silence didn't break. It deepened. It was the kind of silence that meant people had forgotten to breathe. Isaiah opened his eyes slowly. For the first time since stepping on stage, he looked out into the crowd. The reaction was immediate and visible. Shock, not pity, not forced politeness, but genuine disbelief. Landon, pale now, stared with a clenched jaw. The clipboard woman blinked several times, pen still unmoving. The pianist gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Acknowledgement. Across the rows, the same people who laughed or whispered now sat speechless. And just as Isaiah began to lower the mic, his breathing steady, shoulders finally relaxed, something unexpected happened. From the hallway outside, the theater door creaked open. A man in a navy blue security uniform stepped halfway into the room, scanning the crowd with calm urgency. He looked down at a folded paper in his hand, then up again. "Excuse me," he said, not loudly, but with authority. "Is there an Isaiah McClendon here?" The room turned toward him. Isaiah blinked, confused. The guard held the paper higher. "I need to speak with you. Right away." The final note still echoed faintly in the corners of the room, even though Isaiah had already lowered the microphone. He didn't move, didn't smile, didn't search the audience for approval. He just stood there, center stage, under the buzzing overhead light, eyes forward, hands clenched at his sides. The silence that followed was different than the tension that had hung in the room before his performance. This was the kind of silence that didn't come from indifference, but from impact. A breathless, tight-chested stillness that weighed down on every person in that room. 5 full seconds passed before anyone even shifted in their seat. The judge with the clipboard had dropped her pen. It now rested beside her shoe unnoticed. Her fingers still hovered in the air where she had been writing before Isaiah sang. Frozen in disbelief, the second judge blinked several times, lips slightly parted as if trying to form a reaction, but unable to find the words. The third leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes locked onto Isaiah with a furrowed brow, not judging, not dismissing, just stunned. The kind of stare reserved for someone who just rewrote the rules without asking permission. Around them, the audition hopefuls, teenagers in blazers and ballet flats, their resumes padded with choir trophies and coach recommendations, sat as if glued to their folding chairs. Not a whisper, not a laugh. Even the kids who had snickered earlier seemed to have shrunk, as if realizing in real time how wrong they'd been. The ones who thought they'd owned the room now looked like background extras in a scene that belonged entirely to Isaiah. Still, he didn't move, and he didn't have to. Because without a single word, he had said everything. In the back of the room, Landon Whitmore sat rigid, his smirk long gone. His fingers fidgeted in his lap, tapping silently against each other, as he watched Isaiah with a new expression. No longer amused, not even angry, but unsettled. This wasn't supposed to happen. Landon had entered this room already crowned in his own mind, his victory a formality. Isaiah wasn't just a surprise, he was a threat, an anomaly that shattered the rules Landon had been raised to believe were unshakable. Talent belonged to pedigree, success to those who were born into it, and power to those who never had to ask for it. But now, all eyes were on Isaiah. Landon's friend Travis shifted beside him. Unlike Landon, Travis had recorded the entire performance without hesitation. His phone screen was still glowing, the video saved and ready. Slowly he turned to look at Landon, his voice barely a whisper. More breath than sound, but just enough to slice through the still air.
"This is gonna blow up."
Landon didn't answer. He was too busy trying to figure out how things had flipped so quickly. He could already feel his place slipping, the narrative changing. He was no longer the boy who owned the room. He was the boy who laughed at the one who owned it for real. And worst of all, people had seen it, witnessed it, captured it. Travis looked back at his screen, thumb hovering over the share icon. He didn't ask for permission, but his voice carried a bitter edge as he muttered, "Should we leak it or bury it?" It wasn't just a question, it was a decision point. Outside the audition room, the hallway was dim and humming with the low buzz of fluorescent lights. The security guard who had called for Isaiah still stood by the door, his paper folded in one hand. He hadn't moved. He hadn't said another word. But now the judges turned toward him, confusion etched into their faces. Isaiah looked down from the stage, startled, unsure whether he was in trouble or being pulled from something he had only just stepped into. He moved slowly, one foot after the other, stepping down from the stage as if leaving something sacred behind. The room stayed quiet, heads following him as he approached the guard. Every step he took felt like a question without an answer. The guard leaned down, his voice low. He handed Isaiah the folded paper, nodded once, and stepped back. Isaiah unfolded it. His eyes scanned the page quickly, his lips parting slightly as he read the printed text. Then, his brow furrowed. He folded the page again and turned back toward the judges. "I need to go outside for a moment," he said, voice quiet but firm. No one objected. He slipped out into the hallway, the heavy door shutting softly behind him. Inside, the silence finally broke, but not into applause. It broke into questions, quiet murmurs, glances exchanged. The girl in the front row leaned toward her friend and whispered something about how he didn't even look nervous. A boy behind her shook his head and muttered that he had never seen anything like that. One judge reached for the microphone to announce the next performer, but paused, then set it down again, realizing no one was ready to move on. Landon's hands were now balled into fists. His face had flushed slightly, jaw tight. He couldn't stop replaying the last 5 minutes. His voice, his laughter, the moment he tried to humiliate Isaiah, and how it had all collapsed around him. He opened his mouth to speak, to make some dismissive comment to reassert control, but nothing came out. Travis, meanwhile, watched the video one more time, lips pursed, considering. He looked over at Landon again. "We could spin it," he said. "Say it was all planned. You were just messing around. Joke vibes." But the tone was different now. There was no confidence in his voice, just uncertainty. Back in the hallway, Isaiah stood by the vending machines, paper still in hand. The fluorescent light above him flickered. He read the final lines of the page again. Slowly this time, as if making sure he hadn't misunderstood. It wasn't from the school. It wasn't from the judges. It was a notice from a private talent scout, one who had received a tip about the auditions, seen a clip of his name on the schedule, and sent word ahead. Isaiah had no idea how his name had landed on anyone's radar. But the message was clear. They wanted to meet him. That night. In person. And attached to the bottom, typed in small formal letters, was the name of a production company Isaiah had only seen in end credits on TV shows. Real ones. Before he could process what it meant, his phone vibrated. He pulled it from his pocket. A message popped up. Unknown number. One sentence. Whatever they offered you, it's not for you. Remember your place. By sunrise, the light filtering through Isaiah's bedroom window was pale and cold, but the glow from his phone screen was blinding. It hadn't stopped vibrating since the moment he lay down, not even for a breath. The first few notifications had startled him. A friend request here, a new follower there, but then began stacking, doubling, tripling. Something had happened, something irreversible, and Isaiah, still curled under his blanket, barely awake, was at the center of it. His performance, the one he hadn't even been sure he'd survive emotionally, was now everywhere. What had started as a single shaky video captured by Trevor had erupted across social media like wildfire. It had been reposted, clipped, shared with filters and stitched with reactions. One girl cried on camera while watching it. Another, a vocal coach with thousands of followers, paused the song halfway through and said she got chills. The captions were explosive. Black boy shuts down rich kids with raw talent. Realest performance I've seen in years. Westbridge won't know what hit them. By the time Isaiah's eyes had fully opened, the video had cleared 800,000 views. The number blinked on his screen like something unreal. His notifications wouldn't stop. Instagram tags, TikTok edits, Twitter debates. People from cities he'd never heard of were typing his name with fire emojis and hashtags. They weren't just reacting to the song, they were reacting to the story. A no-name black kid silencing an elite room full of smug privilege with nothing but his voice. It was the kind of narrative that ignited online audiences. Isaiah didn't have a team, a stylist, or a vocal coach. He had a soaked hoodie, a trembling voice, and honesty. That's what had cracked the world open. But beneath the flood of praise, a quieter, more insidious current began to show itself. Some comments didn't sound like compliments. They sounded like warnings. People praising his talent but questioning how long it would last. Comments laced with subtle expectations. He better not turn cocky now. Hope he doesn't waste this chance like the rest. Others began dissecting his performance, comparing him to famous black singers as if that were the only context for his existence. He wasn't being seen as Isaiah. He was becoming a symbol, and symbols are rarely allowed to be human. Still, for now, most of the noise was positive. One post had even gone viral on a celebrity account. A musician Isaiah had listened to religiously during his lowest nights. His caption read simply, "This kid just reminded me why I started singing." That comment alone had Isaiah frozen in bed, his chest tight with disbelief. His phone nearly slipped from his hands. But in between the outpouring, one message stopped him cold. It was buried deep in the replies to a reposted clip, the one with over 100,000 likes. Most of the comments were excited, hard-eyed, stunned. But this one, plain and cold, stood out like a rusted nail in glass. Not with that skin.
4 words.
No profile picture. No username worth remembering. Just a blunt, deliberate statement like a bullet in a quiet room. Isaiah blinked at the screen. His heart didn't race. It slowed. The words didn't surprise him. But they still landed with a weight that couldn't be ignored. They weren't loud or public enough to cause a stir. They were surgical, designed to be read in private, meant only for him, and in a way that made them more dangerous. He had expected it eventually. The more the video spread, the more people would have opinions not just about his voice, but about him, about his face, his background, his place in the world. The idea that he could rise without permission would always threaten those who believed they owned the right to sing on that stage. Still, reading it in black and white on his screen made the message real. This wasn't just a celebration, it was a countdown. Back at school, Isaiah's name was no longer whispered in confusion. It was now spoken in reverence, envy, and tension. Some students who had never looked his way now trailed behind him in the halls, trying to record him walking, asking if he'd sing again. Others stared with tight smiles, offering shallow congratulations that sounded more like rehearsed lines. The teachers had started watching him differently too, some with pride, some with discomfort, unsure of how to praise him without making it political, or worse, without exposing the fact that they'd never expected this from him. And somewhere in the noise, Landon had vanished from the center of attention. Isaiah hadn't seen him since the night of the audition. No posts, no comments, not even hallway glances. It was like Landon had retreated into the shadows, licking wounds he didn't know how to explain. But Isaiah could feel something brewing. Silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Landon wasn't done. He was simply recalibrating. Later that afternoon, Isaiah sat at the edge of his bed, staring at his phone as new messages came in. Most were encouraging. Some were media requests. One even offered to represent him for a cut of future earnings. But he ignored them all. His eyes kept returning to that comment. Not with that skin. It looped in his head, taunting him in a voice not his own. No matter how much the world celebrated his voice, it seemed there would always be a footnote, always a reminder that some believed he was still trespassing in spaces built to exclude him. And just as he was about to close the app, another notification appeared. It wasn't from a stranger. It was from someone he knew. His old music teacher, the one who once told him he was a little too soulful for classical training, had shared the video on Facebook with a glowing caption, claiming to have always seen his potential. Isaiah stared at the post, his jaw clenched. He hadn't spoken to her in over a year, not since she told him quietly but clearly that he should think practically about his future instead of chasing dreams. Yet here she was, claiming him now that the internet had. As his phone buzzed again, Isaiah stood and walked to the window. The sun was higher now, but it didn't warm him. Somewhere far from his bedroom, in a sleek office behind a private school campus, a group of well-dressed men sat in a meeting, watching the same viral video. They weren't smiling. One of them clicked pause, and with calm precision he turned to the others and said, "We need to protect our own. Start digging into the kid's background. Anything we can use." It didn't take long for the current to shift. What began as a tidal wave of praise soon morphed into something darker, more familiar, more exhausting. The very platforms that had propelled Isaiah into national visibility were now turning into arenas where admiration and hate danced side by side, unequally, uneasily. With every refresh, his notifications multiplied, but so did the discomfort. In one breath, strangers called him a once-in-a-generation talent. In the next, they mocked his skin, his clothes, his posture on stage. His voice had pierced the silence, but the cost was beginning to show. Some of the comments were subtle, dressed in civility. They questioned his tone or called his audition surprisingly good for someone from his background, as if talent and poverty couldn't coexist. Others weren't subtle at all. Monkey emojis lined comment threads. A viral meme began circulating, with Isaiah's face superimposed on a caricature from an old minstrel cartoon. Captioned, "The Hood Sings Back." It wasn't satire. It was strategy, digital intimidation masked as humor. And the accounts posting it weren't anonymous bots. They were classmates, local teens, kids he'd passed in hallways. The usernames weren't hidden. The hate wasn't hiding. At first, Isaiah tried to ignore it. He told himself to focus on the good, the scouts reaching out, the reposts from musicians he admired, the teachers who now nodded in the hall with newfound respect. But even praise came wrapped in discomfort. Adults who had never spoken to him now referenced his race before his name. He became the black kid who sang, a symbol instead of a student. And each time someone praised him, it was laced with an unspoken message. Look at you doing well despite everything. He knew what they meant. They meant despite being you. The ugliness escalated. Someone edited a clip of his audition, added subtitles filled with slurs, and posted it with a trending hashtag. Others piled on. A debate erupted in the comments about whether he deserved the attention at all. One person questioned if his rags to riches narrative was staged, suggesting he was a planted story meant to inspire liberal tears. The more Isaiah's name spread, the more ownership people claimed over his narrative. He wasn't a person anymore. He was a headline, a reaction, a controversy people used to perform their own identities. At school, the temperature changed. The same teachers who now called on him in class seemed overly careful with their words, like they were walking on eggshells. Some smiled too wide, others not at all. A few students whispered when he passed, others looked away. The hallway was louder than usual, but cold even. The choir room, once the only space that gave him calm, now echoed with tension. A few of the older choir kids kept their distance. One boy, part of Landon's circle, muttered the word quota as Isaiah walked past. He didn't confront it. Not yet, but he felt it all. He carried it home like static on his skin. His mother tried to understand. She stood in the kitchen reading articles about him. Half proud, half fearful. She didn't say much, but her eyes tracked the headlines with unease. She knew this story too well, how fast a black boy could rise in white spaces, and how even faster he could fall when people decided they'd seen enough. One night, Isaiah sat on the edge of his bed, scrolling through hundreds of DMs. Some were from fans. Others offered advice or prayer, or money, or promises. A few felt genuine, but the one that stopped him cold came from a private account with no profile photo and no mutual connections. The message preview blinked across his screen like a warning flare. He opened it. The message was short. 12 words. You better not show up to the talent show. We'll make sure you never sing again. He stared at it for a long time, not blinking, not breathing. There was no name, no threats of violence, no signature, just the calm clarity of intent. This wasn't trolling. This wasn't someone fishing for a reaction. This was someone real. Someone close enough to know. For the first time since his audition, Isaiah felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel yet. Fear. Not the stage fright kind. Not the anxious, sweaty palms kind. But the deep, ancestral kind. The kind of fear that comes when you realize your body, your presence, your success is a provocation. That being visible is its own form of danger. That to be seen is to be targeted. He didn't tell anyone. Not his mom. Not the teacher who'd started mentoring him. Not even his closest classmate, who had been defending him online. He simply put the phone face down and sat in silence. But the damage had already seeped in. That night, Isaiah dreamed of singing in front of a crowd where no one had faces, only phones. Their cameras flashed. Their mouths never moved. But in the background a voice whispered the same sentence over and over again. Stick to rap. The next morning, the school principal sent out an all-staff email reminding teachers to support students navigating social media attention. A message so vague, it barely acknowledged what was really happening. There were no conversations, no protection, just distance. One teacher told Isaiah he was brave, and then walked away before he could reply. In the locker room, someone had scrawled 15 minutes is almost up across a bathroom mirror. At lunch his tray disappeared before he sat down. And in the hallway, as he walked to class, Isaiah spotted a small poster stapled crookedly to the bulletin board. It had been made to look official, but it wasn't. A photo of him mid-performance, mouth open, eyes closed. Below it someone had written in bold red marker, "Congrats on being a totem." Isaiah didn't pull it down. He didn't cry. He just stood there, reading it. While behind him, the hallway noise grew louder. He had become a symbol, and symbols are easier to burn than people. But what he didn't know, what no one in that hallway knew, was that a second DM had just arrived. Same account. This time just one sentence. Your voice won't save you next time. The kitchen light flickered softly overhead as Isaiah stood in the doorway, damp from the cold evening air, his backpack hanging low off one shoulder. His mother was at the sink, rinsing collard greens in a plastic colander, her back turned to him, but she didn't need to see him to feel him walk in. She knew her son's footsteps the same way she knew the sounds of the house. Each creak of the floorboards, each rustle of the fridge door, each breath he held when something was weighing too heavy on his chest. She turned around slowly, wiped her hands on the hem of her apron, and without a word walked to him and wrapped her arms around his body like she was shielding something sacred. Isaiah stiffened at first. He always did. But then he let go. He let the weight of the last few days pour silently into her arms. She squeezed him tight, her chin resting against his shoulder, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, he let himself feel small again. Not the kind of small that meant weak, but the kind that meant safe. Still, his mother's breath was shaky, and though her eyes were glazed with pride, her hands trembled as they pressed against his back. She didn't ask about the DMs. She didn't need to. The lines on her face already knew what kind of ugliness came with being too visible in a world not built for boys like her son. She had lived long enough to see how quickly attention turned to ammunition, how applause could become a firing squad once a black boy stopped entertaining and started existing in power. She wanted to be proud. She was proud. but it came laced with a deep, aching fear she couldn't shake. They sat down for dinner, just the two of them, like always. Isaiah barely touched his food. His mother spoke softly about how she had seen him trending online, how her coworkers played the video on repeat, in the break room, how the janitor cried while watching it, and said, "That boy's voice got God in it." She smiled as she said it, but her fingers gripped her fork too tightly. Every word of praise she passed along felt like it carried a silent warning. Don't let them take this from you. Don't let them twist it. After dinner, Isaiah went to his room, but he didn't scroll. He couldn't. The messages, the edits, the threats, they were always waiting. Instead, he sat on the edge of his bed, stared at the floor, and listened to the muffled sound of the TV in the living room, where his mother sat, her laughter a little too forced as she watched reruns of old sitcoms. She wanted him to believe everything was okay, that they were still normal, that the world outside the door hadn't changed. But they both knew better. Outside, the neighborhood was unusually quiet. Their block was lined with small homes and chain-link fences, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business before it was even spoken aloud. Some neighbors had been kind since the video went viral, offering compliments, asking if Isaiah would sing at church, sending food over just because. But others had pulled back. Some who used to wave now stared longer. Some who once dropped by for small talk now closed their doors faster. Fame didn't just bring visibility, it brought division, and it brought resentment. By the time the clock hit midnight, the house was still. Isaiah lay awake, eyes on the ceiling, body rigid beneath his thin blanket. The streetlight outside painted orange shadows across his wall. He had hoped sleep would come easier tonight, that maybe the noise would fade for a few hours. But deep down, he knew something was building. Something just out of view, waiting for the perfect moment to announce itself. And then it came. A dull thump, then another, then the unmistakable sound of something wet, splattering against wood. Isaiah sat up fast. His heart began to race before his feet hit the floor. From the hallway, his mother's door creaked open, her footsteps padding quickly toward the front of the house. She didn't scream, she didn't call out. Years of surviving had taught her silence was sometimes the best defense. Isaiah followed her, pulse hammering. She was already at the door when he reached her, standing completely still, staring through the thin pane of glass near the top. Her hand covered her mouth. Her other hand trembled on the knob. He looked past her. The porch was splattered in egg yolk, dripping down the railing in slow, sticky trails. Shells littered the welcome mat. But it wasn't the mess that made his stomach drop. It was the red paint. It was smeared across the front window. Thick, uneven strokes, still wet. And in all capital letters, like a commandment scrawled in blood, it read, "Stay in your place." For a long time, neither of them spoke. His mother finally backed away from the door, her face pale, her chest rising too fast. Isaiah stepped forward, his fists clenched, his throat dry. He wanted to shout. He wanted to run outside, to catch whoever did it, to prove he wasn't scared. But instead he stood there, eyes fixed on the window, the words burning into his brain. He had been expecting a reaction. He hadn't expected this. He thought the worst would come online, through a screen hidden behind usernames and private accounts. But now the hate had a door. It had handwriting. It had weight. It lived in their world, not just in their mentions. And it had come close. Too close. As his mother locked the door again and reached for her phone to call someone, anyone, Isaiah remained frozen. Part of him knew this wasn't about the eggs or the paint. It was about erasure, about the rules he'd broken by being too talented, too unapologetic, too black in a space where invisibility had been safer. But even as fear wrapped itself around his spine, something else ignited beneath it. A new edge. A fire. They hadn't silenced him. They had proven they were listening, and that terrified them more than anything. What he didn't know, not yet, was that somewhere 2 blocks away, someone was watching their house from the shadows. Phone in hand, hood pulled tight, heart steady, and on their screen, a new post was being drafted. Not about Isaiah's voice, but about ending it. Landon Whitmore sat in the back seat of his father's Range Rover, arms folded, the glow from his phone casting sharp shadows across his face. The car was parked behind the school's tennis courts, where no cameras pointed and no questions would be asked. His jaw was tight, lips pressed thin, but his eyes were alive with quiet calculation. His finger tapped the screen slowly, scrolling through endless posts of Isaiah's video, his performance, his face, his name, everywhere. For years, Landon had been Westbridge Academy's favorite son, the golden boy, the polished product of private tutors, annual galas, and weekend drama intensives paid for by foundation money that bore his last name. He had been the default, not just because he was good, but because he was expected to lead, to win, to receive applause. Isaiah hadn't just interrupted that narrative, he had hijacked it. And worse, Landon hadn't seen it coming. That was what aided him the most. He hadn't even considered Isaiah a threat. He thought the laugh would rattle him. He thought the moment would collapse before it began. Instead, it turned him into a meme, a metaphor, a symbol. Landon felt robbed. But not in the literal sense. He still had everything. The house, the name, the network. But in the eyes of the public, he had lost something more fragile. His image. His curated identity. And in his world, that loss was war. He didn't plan to fight fair. He didn't need to. Fairness was for people who had something to prove. Landon had only one goal now: control the story. And if he couldn't control it by earning it back, he would do it by tearing the other down. That night, while his parents attended a donor dinner downtown, Landon locked himself in his media room with 2 energy drinks, a high-speed editing app, and hours of footage, not of Isaiah singing but of Isaiah existing. Backed by money and access, Landon had connections. Isaiah didn't. Private surveillance footage. Archived security logs. He had a friend whose father managed the school's security contractor. And all it took was one flippant request, framed as a joke, to gain access to hallway clips, event videos, cafeteria recordings. Landon scrubbed through it obsessively, pausing on every shot where Isaiah spoke, laughed, or sat alone with headphones. He wasn't searching for wrongdoing. He was searching for angles, expressions, out-of-context moments he could manipulate. Then he found it. A 10-second clip from the student lounge weeks before the audition. Isaiah had been sitting with 2 other black students, the 3 of them talking and laughing, as a television played the national anthem in the background. Isaiah had his hoodie up, legs crossed, hands folded in his lap. He hadn't stood, neither had his friends. They had been joking about something unrelated, something harmless. But Landon had what he needed. He stripped the sound, zoomed in, saturated the footage, inserted a dramatic zoom and added music, the kind of patriotic underscoring that made everything feel more serious than it was. Then came the subtitles, completely fabricated. He added text that suggested Isaiah had insulted the anthem, that he had laughed at it, that he had told others not to respect it. None of it was true, but the video was convincing. The timing, the edits, the tone. They told a story people would be ready to believe if they wanted to. And Landon knew many would want to. He gave it a title, entitled Talent Show Star Mocks America Behind Closed Doors. He posted it anonymously to a conservative-leaning message board, known for sparking outrage. From there it was scraped and reshared by 3 local pages that thrived on drama. He didn't tag Isaiah. He didn't need to. The image did the work. The comments rolled in within minutes. The next step was simple. Landon took the video file, attached it to a burner email account, and sent it to the school principal. No name. No explanation. Just a sentence in the subject line. Is this the student you're promoting? By morning the email had been opened. The video watched. And the fire had begun. At school, Isaiah noticed the shift before he even reached his locker. The stares were back, but not in awe, in suspicion. Teachers who had once smiled now offered tight nods. Students walked in clusters, whispering just loud enough for him to hear fragments. Someone had taped a copy of the US flag to his locker, with the words disgrace written across it in red Sharpie. In the cafeteria, 2 students stood during the anthem and stared directly at him. The entire time. He hadn't even sat down yet. He didn't understand what had changed until he opened his phone and saw the video. At first he thought it was a joke, until he realized what he was watching. His own face, his own slouch, his own laugh, stripped of sound, replaced by someone else's narrative. The headline burned into his screen. The comment section was a war zone. Some people defended him. Others demanded the school take action. A few went further, calling for his scholarship to be revoked, accusing him of hating the country, questioning his character. Isaiah's hands shook as he read. Not because he believed it, but because he knew exactly how this worked. Perception was reality in these spaces. It didn't matter what was true, it mattered what could be made to feel true. And the video had already spread too far. In the principal's office, there was no hearing, No questioning, no investigation, just a message relayed quietly through his guidance counselor. Isaiah should consider stepping back from public performances while things settle. It wasn't framed as punishment. It was offered as protection. But Isaiah heard the message clearly. Lay low. Be grateful. Don't make this harsher than it has to be. Outside the building, Landon watched the fallout unfold from the library. Earbuds in, sipping a smoothie. He wasn't gloating. He didn't need to. The machine was doing the work for him now. And just as Isaiah sat in a quiet, half-empty classroom, his phone buzzing with both support and suspicion, an announcement came over the intercom. It was short. Formal. The school's winter showcase, the final round of the talent competition, had been postponed due to unforeseen complications. Isaiah didn't flinch. He just stared at his hands. But deep down, something was unraveling. The world had celebrated him for a moment. Now it was trying to erase him again. What he didn't know was that while the video trended, a whistleblower had just contacted a local journalist, someone who knew how Landon got that footage, and someone ready to talk. The halls of Westbridge Academy looked the same, but nothing felt the same. When Isaiah walked through the double doors that morning, the air itself felt colder. Not in temperature, the quiet tension that clung to the walls wasn't visible, but it was present in every sideways glance, every shoulder that subtly turned away, every group that closed its circle tighter when he neared. This was the same school where classmates once clapped for him in the cafeteria, where teachers quoted his lyrics, and where his voice had made the world pause. Now his steps echoed with isolation. No one called his name. No one waited at his locker. Their silence was not passive. It was a strategy. It was the kind of silence designed to erase you without ever having to touch you. The shift was surgical. Whispers trailed behind him, like shadows. Not loud, but sharp enough to be felt. He caught fragments as he passed, quiet murmurs about disrespect, half-spoken references to fake patriotism, and comments framed as jokes, but meant to wound. Someone muttered "Anthem Boy" while passing him, laughing just loud enough for others to join in. Teachers who once praised his discipline now glanced over him during roll call, their once warm nods replaced by guarded expression. Even the principal, who had once promised to nurture student excellence, barely acknowledged him in the hallway. The edited video may have been fake, but the doubt it planted was real, and it was spreading. During lunch, Isaiah moved like a ghost. His usual table was taken, not by strangers, but by students he used to laugh with, study with, sing with. Now they filled the seats like placeholders in a scene they didn't want him in. A few looked up when he approached, then quickly looked down again. He didn't ask questions. He just turned and walked to a table near the back, wedged between the trash bins and the exit door. No one followed. He picked at his food, barely tasting it, ears tuned to conversations that didn't include him. The energy had shifted from celebration to containment. He wasn't being punished in rules or suspension slips. He was being erased by culture, slowly, deliberately. In the classrooms, it was no better. He raised his hand once in English. The teacher called on someone else. He tried again in world history. Silence. A few students smirked when he lowered his hand, as if they'd bet on that outcome. One boy cracked a pencil between his fingers and said loudly, "Some people think they're famous, but forget they're still in high school." It wasn't aimed directly at Isaiah, but everyone knew who it was for. The message was clear. Know your place. Stay quiet. Fate. By the time the final bell rang, Isaiah had stopped trying to speak. He avoided eye contact. He ignored the phones angled in his direction. He carried his books against his chest, as if shielding something sacred. As he moved through the emptying halls, he passed a locker that had been decorated with red, white, and blue ribbons. Taped across it was a printed screenshot of the fake video, and someone had written "Dias Grace" in block letters beneath it. He paused. No one was around, but he didn't tear it down. He didn't even touch it. He just kept walking, jaw clenched, eyes forward. Near the bathroom at the far end of the hall, the lights flickered above his head. As he pushed the door open, the smell of bleach and cheap soap mixed with steam from recently mopped tiles. The room was quiet, empty. It felt like the only space in the school that wasn't watching him. He walked past the sinks, past the cracked mirror, into the last stall, the one where the door never quite closed. He wasn't there to use it. He just needed to sit. He dropped the toilet seat lid, sat down, and leaned back against the cold metal, letting the stillness wash over him. For the first time that day, he let his breath slow. He didn't cry. He didn't think he could cry anymore. There was just a dull weight behind his ribs. Not pain exactly, but pressure, like something unfinished and angry, trying to claw its way out. He wanted to believe it would pass, that it was just a phase, but he'd lived too long in this skin to be fooled by temporary silences. He knew how this worked. They didn't want a black boy who shined. They wanted a black boy who knew his place. And then he saw it, scratched into the back of the stall door. Jagged and cruel, were 4 words that stopped his heart mid-beat. You'll never be one of us. The letters were carved deep, as if the person who wrote it needed the message to scar the metal. It wasn't graffiti. It was a sentence passed down by someone who didn't just dislike him. They needed to remind him that no matter how talented, how loved, how viral he became, he would never belong. Not here, not fully, not safely. Isaiah stared at the words for a long time. The tile beneath his feet felt colder. His chest rose and fell, slower now, each breath sharper than the last. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. But something inside him, something warm and defiant, began to harden. The silence outside the stall deepened. Somewhere in the distance, the school intercom buzzed briefly and went quiet again. What Isaiah didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that just outside the bathroom, someone else had paused in the hallway, watching through the open crack of the door. Not with judgment, not with malice, but with quiet concern. Someone who had heard the hallway jokes. Someone who had seen the way the laughter stopped when Isaiah passed. Someone who had stayed silent too long, but not anymore. Tomorrow, everything would change, because Isaiah wasn't the only one who refused to disappear. Miss Calloway had been at Westbridge for only 3 weeks, but she already understood the rhythm of the school. Who held the social power, which students walked the halls without fear, and which ones were slowly shrinking into the shadows. She wasn't young, but she was new, transferred mid-semester to take over the music theory class, after the previous teacher retired unexpectedly. Most faculty treated her with polite distance, like a substitute who'd overstayed her welcome. But Miss Calloway had taught long enough in other districts that didn't have legacy donors or championship banners, to know what marginalization looked like, even when it came disguised in high test scores and clean uniform. She noticed Isaiah the moment she stepped into her new classroom. Not because he spoke, he rarely did, but because he didn't. There was a heaviness about him, a way he moved like he was always carrying something invisible, but crushed. And though she hadn't yet heard his voice in person, she had seen the video. Of course she had. Everyone had. But what caught her wasn't the singing. It was what followed. The silence, the isolation, the unspoken shift in how everyone else looked at him afterward. Miss Calloway had seen that pattern before. Black brilliance punished, not celebrated. Talent tolerated only when it didn't outshine those it wasn't meant to. For days she watched as Isaiah sat silently in the back of her class, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on his notebook but never writing. His participation was minimal. When she played piano scales or vocal recordings, he barely lifted his head. She saw the other students glance at him with curiosity, but none of them reached out. It was as if his fame had expired, and now he was just something fragile they didn't want to touch. The final moment that pushed her to act came during a midweek lecture. She had been playing a choral arrangement through the class speakers, something from an old Broadway show, and as the final note rang out, she noticed Isaiah staring straight ahead, motionless. Not bored, not distracted, but haunted, as if the sound had reminded him of something he'd buried. When the bell rang, he left the room quickly, not making eye contact with anyone. Miss Calloway stood by the piano, watching the door swing shut behind him, and made her decision. She didn't ask the principal for permission. She didn't call a meeting or send an email. Instead, during her free period, she walked the halls until she found Isaiah standing alone, by the vending machines near the art wing. The place students went when they didn't want to be seen. He looked up as she approached, startled, unsure whether to brace or flee. But Miss Calloway didn't lead with questions. She simply stood beside him, quietly, for a long moment. Then she said one thing, calm and clear, not a demand, not a correction. You haven't sung in a while. Isaiah didn't respond at first. He didn't even blink, but his shoulders tightened, his grip on his backpack strap tensed. She continued, gently, her voice like soft gravel. I've seen what's happening. I've seen the posts. I've seen how they look at you now. He turned his head slightly. but still said nothing. You don't owe them anything. Not a smile, not a performance. But you owe something to yourself. His eyes flicked toward her, just briefly, the kind of glance that didn't ask for help but no longer rejected it. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small black flash drive. It was unmarked, plain, easy to overlook, but she held it like it carried something sacred. Handing it to him, she said only one thing. This is yours now. Isaiah took it, cautious, confused. What's this? He finally asked, his voice barely louder than a whisper. She didn't answer right away. She let the silence stretch, letting him feel the weight of being seen, fully and without condition. Then, her voice steady, she replied, Your voice deserves a stage. This is your way back in. He looked down at the flash drive in his hand, unsure whether it was a gift or a responsibility. What Isaiah didn't know, what no one knew, was that Miss Calloway had spent the last 4 nights building something in secret. After hours in the music lab, using old audio software and the school's underused recording equipment, she had taken clips of his viral audition and arranged them into a full demo. Cleaned, edited, layered with soft instrumentation. She had even recorded a brief piano accompaniment to blend beneath his vocals. The result wasn't just a performance, it was a portfolio, a proof of voice. Something undeniable, something industry-worthy, something powerful. And on that flash drive were 2 folders. One with Isaiah's demo, the other with application forms for a national youth performing arts program, whose deadline was only 3 days away. Isaiah held the flash drive tightly, his fingers curling around the edges like it might disappear if he didn't. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, with a slow nod, he slipped it into his pocket and whispered a quiet thank you that didn't quite reach his lips. Miss Calloway didn't push further. She simply turned and walked away, leaving him alone, with the weight of choice. But just as she turned the corner of the hallway, her phone buzzed. She paused, checking the screen. An email, subject line anonymous faculty tip, urgent. She opened it, frowning. Inside was a single sentence. Landon Whitmore accessed private surveillance footage without clearance, and attached was the original time-stamped security file. Unedited. Clean. The music room felt like a different world after dark. The lights overhead hummed faintly, casting soft reflections across the varnished wood of the piano, and the windows mirrored back Isaiah's silhouette like a ghost watching itself move. It was always quiet after hours, no bell schedule, no hallway chatter, no footsteps echoing around corners, just stillness. It was the only space in the school where Isaiah didn't feel like he was being watched, whispered about, or recorded. It was the only place where he could hear himself clearly again. Most nights he waited until the rest of the students had left. Miss Calloway would unlock the music wing for him with a simple nod and then leave him to it. No lectures, no expectations, just a door quietly left open, a piano already uncovered, and a safe silence that gave him permission to try again. There were no audiences here, no viral stakes, no phones waiting to twist his image. It was just Isaiah and the music, and at first even that felt broken. The first night back, his voice cracked on the second note. He had barely gotten past the intro before self-doubt crept in, tightening his throat. It wasn't technical failure, it was emotional collapse. The memory of what had been done to him. The video, the rumors, the messages, the paint on his window, the bathroom graffiti. Every time he opened his mouth, it was like the world's hate reached into his lungs and pulled the breath out. But he kept coming back night after night, one verse, then one chorus, then an entire bridge. And slowly, painfully, his voice returned, not as a performance but as an act of reclamation. He sang not to impress, he sang to survive. His voice, once celebrated, had been turned against him. It had become a weapon others tried to use for their gain, or silence out of fear. Now he was taking it back, not for applause, not even for revenge, but because he had to. Because if they stole that from him too, there would be nothing left. Each night he pushed himself harder. Miss Calloway had left behind the flash drive, but she'd also printed out sheet music, exercise routines, breathing techniques. She didn't hover. She trusted him to figure it out, and he did, between yawns, over sore chords, through moments when doubt almost drowned him. He stayed until the janitor flipped the lights twice. Then he walked home under the stars with his backpack heavy and his hoodie zipped high against the cold. At home, his mother didn't ask questions. She just warmed leftovers, kept the porch light on, and said, "Keep doing what they don't expect you to." She didn't need to know the details. She'd seen enough in her life to understand the quiet fight in her son's eyes. But the closer the showcase got, the heavier the pressure became. Whispers around school said Isaiah might be performing again. Rumors spread like brushfire, some hopeful, others hostile. One student posted a poll on Instagram: should Isaiah be allowed back on stage? The yes votes were outnumbered 2-1. Teachers stayed silent. The principal never mentioned the show again. Isaiah had been given quiet permission to return, but no protection, no apology, no acknowledgement of what had been done to him. Even Landon had been unusually silent. No smug glances, no cryptic comments. That made Isaiah more uneasy than any open threat. Landon wasn't the kind to disappear. He was the kind to wait. One night, Isaiah found a note on the piano bench. No name, no envelope, just a single sheet of paper. They want you quiet. That's why you have to be louder. He didn't know who had written it, but he read it 3 times before folding it carefully and slipping it into his notebook. By the final week, his voice was steady again. Stronger, even. Not perfect, but raw, grounded. There was something new in his tone now, something textured by what he had endured. His runs weren't cleaner, but they were heavier. His breath control was sharper, because now every note came from a place of truth, not technique. Every line he rehearsed reminded him that his presence wasn't permission. It was protest. And still, doubt lingered. The night before the showcase, Isaiah stayed late. Later than usual. Miss Calloway hadn't come by. The janitor had left early. The building was still. Outside the windows, rain had started to fall, tapping lightly against the glass, like an old clock. He practiced in low tones, conserving his voice. He didn't push. He reflected. He sat at the piano for a while, without singing at all, fingers hovering over keys he hadn't learned how to play. The quiet was calming. But underneath, nerves simmered like a quiet boil. When he finally packed up to leave, it was close to midnight. The school was empty, dimly lit by the emergency hall lights. His footsteps echoed as he moved toward his locker to grab a spare folder he'd left behind. He didn't expect anyone to be around. The silence gave him comfort. But when he reached his locker, he saw something new. Folded neatly into the slats of the door was a note. Plain white paper, no name. For a moment, he thought it might be another message from his quiet supporter. Maybe a quote, maybe encouragement. But when he unfolded the note, his heart stopped. The handwriting was sharp, angry, every letter slashed into the page. Sing tomorrow and you'll regret it. No signature, no threats of violence. Just that single sentence. Cold, direct, designed to sink. Isaiah didn't move for a full minute. His hands didn't shake. His face didn't change. But something inside him cracked open, not from fear but from clarity. They still thought they could control him, even after everything. And now he had a decision to make. Because this wasn't just about a song anymore. It was about silence, and whether or not he would let them own it. The gymnasium smelled of old wood, fresh polish, and raw anticipation, a mix that made the floorboards hum when the crowd shifted. Bleachers were packed with parents in winter coats, students clutching phones, and faculty trying to maintain composure under stage light. The makeshift stage stood at one end, curtains heavy and burgundy, flanked by speakers that threatened to rattle at any strong note. Tonight was the final showdown, the Westbridge Academy Winter Showcase. The air vibrated with expectation. It should have been celebratory. For many it was the big moment, a chance to reclaim pride, earn applause, cement status. For Landon Whitmore it was a coronation. For Isaiah McClendon, it felt like stepping into a storm. Landon walked on stage first. The spotlight hit him like a halo. He wore a tailored suit, his posture perfect, his smile timed. He greeted the audience with practiced ease. Whatever doubts had once hovered about him, about competition, were erased in that moment. The crowd roared, phones raised. Applause thundered. His performance unfolded with flawless execution. Polished vocals, confident choreography, casts of smiles, waves, theatrical gestures. The audience ate it up. By the final note, they were on their feet, cheering, whistling, slapping seats. For Landon it was validation. For a moment he looked at the wings, maybe expecting Isaiah to stand there startled, humbled, waiting behind the curtain. But there was no sign of the boy he had tried to bury. The victory felt whole, owned, sealed. Backstage, as Landon bowed and walked off under flashing lights and cheers, something in the air shifted. The roar seemed too eager, too loud, a hunger rather than a celebration. A few parents clapped half-heartedly, scanning the audience, glancing at friends. Some students looked down at their phones. The blaze of acclaim lingered, but around it was a current of discomfort, like electricity after thunder. Landon didn't notice, or refuse to, but the complexion of the crowd had changed. The applause ended, lights dimmed slightly for transition, and the curtain closed. A hush filled the gym as volunteers behind the scenes cleared the stage and prepared for the next act. Then the name was called. Isaiah McClendon. Everything paused. Forks hovered midair. Phones stopped vibrating. The stage lights flickered, as though hesitating before breathing life into the next moment. A single spotlight clicked on, sharp and unwavering. In that circle of light, the floor felt smaller, more fragile. A weight pressed down in Isaiah's chest, the cumulative weight of stares, edits, hate, respect, fear, and hope. The world seemed to hold its breath. He walked forward slowly, each step measured, heart pounding in a rhythm that felt both ancient and immediate. The hum of the drywall, the buzz of the lights, even the distant whispers backstage, faded to a distant echo. For a moment he was alone. Not the viral sensation, not the scandal, not the rumor, or the graffiti. Just a boy with a voice, standing in light. The curtain behind him closed. The crowd, hundreds, maybe 1,000, seemed too far and yet dangerously near. He raised the mic, fingers soft around the stand. The silence could have broken glass, but something held it together, air thick with waiting. The venue lights above shifted slightly, as the sound technician adjusted volume. Behind him the piano accompaniment kicked in, soft, minimal, a simple rhythm to cradle a voice raw and waiting. Then Isaiah began to sing. The first note fell like dew at dawn, delicate, hesitant, yet carrying a tremor that spoke louder than confidence ever could. The room exhaled. People leaned forward. Some closed their eyes. The spilled concentration was palpable. The chord beneath him rose smooth and low, supporting his pitch but not masking it. Not this time. This time, the voice was bare, vulnerable, true. As the song advanced, his voice gathered strength. It didn't climb to perfection, but it grew in presence, echoing off the rafters, dancing over the heads of audience members, weaving through rows of spectators, who held their breath as though the collective exhale might break the spell. The notes weren't toey. There was no run to flaunt, no dramatic falsetto designed for applause. Instead, his tone gave space. It owned silence before filling it. It carried sorrow, pride, anger, and resilience all at once, subtle layers that didn't require comprehension to feel. For some, it stirred memories. For others, a deep, hollow ache. For those who had ridiculed him, it was an unspoken reckoning. Back in the crowd, faces shifted. Parents held napkins to their lips. Students leaned forward. Some raised their phones, but almost no one recorded. The moment demanded presence rather than proof. Among the quiet watchers, one teacher's eyes glistened. Another buried her gaze behind the stage curtains, as though unworthy of witnessing what she heard. The sound technician seemed frozen, one hand still on the mixing board. Volunteers near the back, who had never stopped talking, had gone still. The world outside those walls had vanished. But then, a distortion. As Isaiah rounded the chorus, a subtle crackle tensed through the sound system. The piano accompaniment faltered. For a split second, the backing track dipped, enough that the crack in the music interrupted the emotional flow. Someone murmured. A hush shifted. The spotlight wavered, flickering twice rapid, then steadied again. The audience held a breath, waiting. The crackle continued, deeper now, sharp enough to stir unease. Someone in the back coughed. Others shifted in their seats. Isaiah didn't stop. His voice didn't waver. He pushed on, but the distortion grew louder. The lights flickered again. Some phones buzzed. Others blinked off. The speaker's hum grew jagged. The perfect moment fractured. Not because of him but because someone else tried to break it. Panic rippled. A few parents stood, arms raised, uncertain. A group of students hissed. The applause that was supposed to come at the end of the song now felt distant, unsure. Behind the stage, chaos stirred. The sound technician sprinted toward cables. A volunteer nudged another, whispering that maybe they should call it off. The curtain's edge trembled as if about to be reeled in. The countdown timer for the next act blinked early. The show was slipping. Isaiah's heart pounded, not from fear, but from clarity. This was no accident. The sabotage was intentional. Someone had tampered with the system. Someone who panicked when the crowd began to lean in, to listen. Someone like Landon, or someone tied to him, who refused to lose the narrative they'd built. The tension snapped tight in his chest, but he didn't retreat. He held the mic closer, let the spotlight sharpen around him, and sang. His voice cut through the distortion. It rose over the hum. It painted over the flicker. It soared not because the sound system worked, but because the truth didn't need a speaker. And the gym, it shifted on its axis. Phones dropped halfway, eyes widened. Some people gasped. Some whispered in disbelief. A few stood, not in applause, but in shock. And at the front row, a group of parents rose, as though drawn upward by their own disbelief. The faint overhead lights seemed to brighten, adjusted to focus, as technicians scrambled to fix cables. And then, for a breathtaking second, silence reclaimed the gym. Total silence. The kind that carried weight. The kind that meant everyone inside had stopped breathing. Even the buzzing fluorescent lights seemed to hold their breath. Then the last note faded. It hung in the air a moment longer, stretched by memory, thickened by tension. The silence stretched too tenuous as a breath held between frost. And then applause. It started slowly, almost shy. A single clap, then another, a few dozen. The claps multiplied. The roar returned, but different. Softer in tone, deeper in feeling. Not shallow cheers but raw, shocked praise. People stood. Some cried. Some whispered, "Did you hear that?" Others raised their hands in quiet reverence, not for a performance, but for truth. Isaiah stood on stage, breath heavy, chest tight, eyes closed. He didn't bow. He didn't move. He just stood. The crowd's noise washed over him, through him, around him, a tide he didn't try to ride. He simply let it flow. He didn't need their noise. He needed their reckoning. Backstage, the drama unfolded with equal intensity. Some faces were stunned, some frantic, some angry, but none unmoved. Landon sat slumped against a wall, arms wrapped around his knees, head bowed. His suit was immaculate, but the aura of victory had drained. The username of his perfect world had just been crossed out. Amid the chaos, a figure in the shadows crept up to the side door of the gym. Someone who had watched all night, phone in hand. The person paused, took a deep breath, and pressed record again. This time not to mock, but to capture truth. Someone who refused to let the darkness win. Above the crowd, lights brightened. The music director grabbed a microphone, stepped on stage, cleared his throat. What he said was low, but carried through the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's give one more round of applause." The applaud broke again, this time louder, harder, sweeter, for a boy who refused to be silenced, for a voice that refused to be buried. Isaiah's eyes opened. He exhaled. And below him, amid the clapping and the tears, someone whispered with awe, "This is real." The gym lights flickered once more, but this time they held steady. The distortion was gone. The speakers hummed clean. The night was still theirs. He had stepped into light. They had tried to cut it off, but they had only made it shine brighter. And somewhere, outside the gym, in a car parked under street lamps, a message was being drafted, a final effort, because the storm didn't end when he sang. It only began. The moment Isaiah's first note cracked through the gymnasium air, it felt as though a veil had lifted. The auditorium, once humming with murmur and shifting bodies, fell silent as if gravity itself paused to listen. That first tone was raw and unrefined, but it carried something unshakable weight. It wasn't polished perfection that filled the space, but truth, the kind of voice that pried open quiet corners of shame, pride, pain, and hope at once. The walls, the rafters, even the dust motes dancing in the spotlight seemed to hush in reverence. It was as though the building itself remembered injustice, and the sound was waking those memories. The piano accompaniment was gentle, supportive, a soft cradle beneath Isaiah's powerful honesty. With every measured chord the keys released, the air thickened with emotion. There was no flash, no flourish, no attempt to dazzle. The power lay in the vulnerability. His voice trembled once, hit a note that wavered on the edge. Not from fear but from raw exposure. And that vulnerability drew people in. Eyes that had once tracked their phones, now turned upward, wide and unguarded. Chins lifted. Even the skeptical faces hardened. Throats tightened. As Isaiah's tune climbed slowly, Note by note, the room responded, not with applause at first, but with stillness, a collective holding of breath as though the audience feared to blink in case they missed something sacred. Somewhere in the mix of cold air and heavy spotlight, tears began to appear. On cheeks, on sleeves, trailing silent streaks down faces that hours ago had sneered or judged. A student in the front row blinked beneath stained lenses. An older parent pressed a tissue against her lips. Phones slowly rose, not in eager capture, but trembling hands lifting as if to bear witness. Their faces glowed with screen light, but the eyes behind them brimmed with stark realization. This wasn't a performance they had come to rate. It was a reckoning they couldn't cancel. Backstage, the energy shifted. Volunteers who had been bustling to reset the stage halted mid-step. The sound technician who just moments ago had scrambled to undo sabotage froze, hands hovering over the mixer knobs. The soft hum of electricity seemed to quiet itself in fear of interrupting. The same auditorium that had earlier cheered for the polished veneer of Landon's showcase now stood captive to something far louder, a truth no edit could silence. Landon Whitmore felt it first as a tremor under his feet. He had watched from the wings, hidden from view, expecting the show to go on like it always did. Applause, validation. His world glossy and untouched. But as the first dozen notes poured from the stage, his breathing tightened. The light that had once brought him warmth now felt threatening, almost hostile. He pressed his back against a side wall, arms wrapping around himself as though trying to shrink down to nothing. The sound invaded his ears, invaded his image, invaded the carefully constructed story of excellence and entitlement he built around himself. Every note Isaiah sang undid something inside him, a thread in his identity, a stitch in his certainty. On stage, the chorus arrived, and the crowd shifted again. The rising melody wove through every corner. Seats, bleachers, corners, balconies. Some people stood, half-hushed, as though afraid to disrespect the weight of what they heard. Others closed their eyes, letting notes wash over them like rain on dry ground. The gym lights, once bright and harsh under stage trusses, softened, as though the building itself exhaled, giving space for sorrow, for healing, for recognition. A hush heavier than any cheer settled, pregnant with the gravity of what this song represented. Not just raw talent, but defiance, resistance, claim. Then came the unexpected twist. Midway through the bridge, as Isaiah's voice trembled toward a high note, the backup tracks faltered. The speakers stuttered again, chords crackled, and a harsh static threatened to swallow the sound. A gasp broke somewhere in the audience, as though someone had tried to silence the truth. But instead of pausing, Isaiah leaned into the crackle. He didn't recoil. He didn't flinch. He let the distortion ride beneath his voice. And then, without missing a beat, he dropped an octave and carried on, shifting tone, carrying emotion, refusing to let technology or sabotage mute him. The distortion crept louder, but his voice got stronger. The crowd held transfixed by that refusal. In that moment, the old promise, the one that said a black kid singing in a mostly white space, would be broken by noise, dismissed by doubt, erased by interference. That promise shattered. The performance became more than music. It became a declaration. He would not be erased. As the final note quivered into silence, the gym held for a heartbeat. Then, a single clap. Then, another. 2, 3, 4 dozen. The sound grew like a landslide. Chairs scraped. Standing ovations erupted. The noise wasn't polite or measured. It was raw, urgent, volcanic. Cheers, sobs, laughter, cries, all colliding in one wave. Phones lowered. Tears left hot trails, and in that moment, the crowd wasn't judging. They were feeling, recognizing. Isaiah stood under the spotlight, chest tight, eyes closed, breathing shallow but real. He didn't bow. He barely moved, because this wasn't about applause. It was about claim. Claim to a voice. Claim to existence. Claim to being heard. Backstage, the contrast couldn't have been sharper. Landon dropped to his knees in the dark, head bowed, shoulders trembling. The weight of the world he thought he owned crushed him. The man-made pedestal of social privilege tilted violently under the weight of a single honest voice. Somewhere between the cheers and the tears, the narrative flipped. The golden boy was gone. The talented outsider stood tall, no longer needing to hide. But then, just as applause crashed around him like waves, someone in the back stood up. Not a student, not a parent, not a student council rep. The school principal emerged into the spotlight, face grave, posture rigid. The music director stopped mid-step. Lights flicked brighter. The applause faltered into murmurs, confusion spreading. In that breathless pause, an unexpected voice rose from the crowd. He didn't see who, but it shouted something low, sharp. A protest. Another followed. The murmur grew. Suddenly the roar of approval collided with a new undercurrent. Challenge. Resistance. Doubt. Phones lifted again, but this time not for praise. They recorded accusations. They recorded suspicion. They clicked. The seats shook, as half the audience stood again. Some for support, others for confrontation. The air thickened. At that precise instant, two things happened at once. Isaiah felt the innocence of his victory crack under pressure. The truth he had believed would set him free suddenly became something louder, harder, something many didn't want to hear. The echo of his voice turned from comfort to weapon. And in the crowd, a figure he never saw before, hooded, back turned, lowered a phone. The screen glowed. The word Lev blinked in red. A live stream. A live feed to hundreds, maybe thousands, of watchers outside the gym. People who wouldn't feel the notes, wouldn't hear the depth. People who hadn't come to listen. They came to react, to judge, to decide for him whether this claimed voice belonged. And the moment they decided, the record would be set in stone. Isaiah's heart pounded, breath shallow, mind racing. The stage lights burned hot above him. The applause pummeled him like rain. But beneath it all lay something colder. Uncertainty, fear, the knowledge that visibility cut both ways. That standing ovation could turn into a verdict, that echo could become an indictment. Landon remained slumped in darkness. But his eyes flicked upward at the same sound. The roar, the shift, the fear. It reached him. It changed him. Not with guilt. Not with shame. With something else. Something colder. Determination. Purpose. A new plan forming behind clenched teeth. Isaiah took a step backward, expecting voices, supportive, admiring, affirming. But instead he heard a hush shift, fabric ripple, and a collective inhale of tension. The auditorium held still again. And in that silent breath, reality shifted. Because sometimes a voice doesn't just echo. Sometimes it awakens. Silence hung in the gym for a heartbeat after the final note faded. Heavy, pregnant with possibility. Then, slowly, like the first drop of rain before a storm, the clapping began. At first tentative, reverent, almost as if people still didn't believe what they heard. But it grew, until every bleacher, every row, every seat. The applause consumed the gym, a resounding tide of affirmation that rose higher and louder than any of the early cheers for polished performances. It was raw, unfiltered, real, as if the walls themselves were agreeing. Justice, finally, had a voice. In that roar, the principal of the school stepped onto the stage. He moved with deliberate calm, his expression grave, no trace of the polished smile he'd worn at the beginning of the night. He walked directly toward Isaiah, who stood under the spotlight, chest rising and falling slow with shock and relief. No one spoke. No microphones cracked. The crowd's noise became a distant hum, a backdrop to the gravity of what was about to unfold. The principal leaned close to Isaiah, placing a hand on his shoulder. A silent gesture of solidarity, not spectacle. Then, clutching a folded envelope in the other hand, he lifted Isaiah's arm and raised it high as though lifting a champion's hand after victory. The gym fell quiet again, the hush heavy and expectant. The envelope glinted under the stage lights. Then the principal pressed a button on the podium microphone. What came next wasn't part of the program. It wasn't announced. It didn't show on the schedule. It was truth. The principal's voice, firm and unyielding, spoke into the silence. It was clear. It echoed across the gym, cutting through the aftershock of applause. They know who doctored the video. The words hung thick in the air. And we are taking action. He paused. The hush deepened. Then heads around the room turned, eyes shifting like a wave. People began looking at each other. Phones were lifted again, not to record a performance, but to capture accountability. The envelope in his hand opened, documents visible to anyone paying attention. Timestamps, original surveillance logs, security contractor records, metadata from the doctored file, evidence. Around the perimeter of the gym, faces paled. Students who had spread the fake clip shifted uncomfortably, others shrank. A few teachers crossed their arms, The volunteers who had helped run the show stiffened. The weight of exposure settled across the auditorium like dust. Isaiah's breathing felt slow in that moment, deliberate and heavy. He was no longer just standing under the spotlight. He was standing for something larger: truth, identity, dignity, all laid bare under harsh light. Fear and hope intertwined in his chest. He dared to breathe in the possibility that maybe, just maybe, justice meant more than survival. The applause resumed slowly, tentative at first, then surging back, deeper, stronger. Not for a performance now, but for honesty, for integrity, for a black boy who refused to be invisible. Even when he was erased, the cheer wasn't polite. It wasn't tentative. It was a verdict, a declaration that what belonged to him belonged, and no amount of noise, sabotage, or slander would change that. Backstage, chaos erupted. A few of Landon's friends pulled at their coats, heads bowed, silent, faces haunted. The sound technician hovered near the cords, hands shaking, as though the weight of what he'd helped hide had just become too heavy. Others stared at each other in disbelief, some sympathetic, some fearful. The carefully constructed hierarchy cracked. Privilege no longer provided immunity. From the wings, Isaiah saw Landon slump against a wall, eyes fixed on the floor, suit jacket unbuttoned, face ashen. The boy who had once strutted in confidence now seemed small, lost, uncertain. The labels had shifted. The author of the fake narrative was now exposed. The crowd no longer believed in him. As the principal continued, detailing the steps the school would take, verifying that disciplinary hearings would begin, promising transparency, the atmosphere changed. It was no longer just about the night's performance. It was about accountability, about turning a spotlight on those who tried to bury the truth beneath lies. Cameras flashed, phones recorded, teachers nodded. Some students wept quietly, others stood with fists pressed to their chests, silent but proud. The gym had become more than a stage. It had become a courtroom of conscience. Isaiah closed his eyes for one short second. When he opened them, he saw the faces of people he barely recognized. Parents, alumni, community members standing, clapping, cheering, wiping tears. He saw respect. He saw acceptance. He saw possibility. The applause washed over him, but it didn't drown him. It lifted him, gave him something more than validation. Landon remained on the cold backstage floor, shoulders heaving slowly with silent remorse. The spotlight had shifted. The power dynamic had been rewritten. And the boy who had once wielded privilege like armor now felt its weight collapse around him. Vulnerability, unearned, bitter, unavoidable, had replaced entitlement. But then, just as the wave of celebration seemed unstoppable, a new voice sliced through it. One that didn't cheer. One that bellowed. At first it was a shout, angry, demanding. It came from the gym doors. The crowd froze. Music director and stage crew turned, startled. The principal's raised hand faltered. A hush swept over the room. A man burst through the doorway. Tall, donned in a tailored overcoat, his face red with fury, presence commanding. He strode toward the stage floor like a storm, eyes locked on Isaiah. In his hand a badge glinted, one no one expected to see in a gym after hours. As he reached the edge of the platform, the spotlight swung around, catching him in harsh clarity. It was Landon's father. He didn't speak, words weren't necessary. His posture, the harsh set of his jaw, the cold fury in his eyes, it told everything. He pointed at Isaiah. His lip curled. He demanded with that look, "Take him off. Now. Protect the real talent. Protect the name. Protect the legacy." The gym, which had moments ago erupted in approval, opened at consensus. A murmur ran like wildfire. Some backed away. Others stiffened in support. The applause died. Confusion replaced reverence. Eyes darted between the principal, still standing at the mic, and the man demanding action. Isaiah's throat closed. His eyes flicked from face to face, teacher to parent, student to alumni. Hearts pounded, phones still recorded. The air tasted like rain before a storm. Heavy, sharp, unforgiving. In that moment, the standing ovation threatened to collapse under the weight of authority and entitlement. The applause that had crowned him might become the chain that pulled him under. The stage he had reclaimed might be stripped away, and as the spotlight held on Landon's father's angry figure, the gym descended into chaos. Half ready to fight, half ready to disappear. The energy crackled. The verdict, whether his voice would hold, or his name would be silenced again, hovered in balance. Isaiah's grip tightened on the mic stand. His breath came shallow, but he didn't step back. Not yet. Not now. He swallowed. And in that moment of silence before what would come next, there was only waiting, only uncertainty, only a truth, raw and burning, still standing under the light. The week after the showcase, the world outside Westbridge Academy felt both familiar and impossibly distant for Isaiah McClendon. His phone never stopped buzzing. Notifications not from bullies, not from haters, but from talent scouts, music schools, community radio stations, even a small independent label from New York. Invitations rolled in, offers to audition for a youth arts program, a chance to record a studio demo for a local nonprofit, an online music platform asking permission to feature his performance. His mother watched the activity unfold in silent awe, often pausing mid-episode of her late-night sitcom reruns to say, "That's my son." Her pride was quiet, but deep. The world was opening up, and for once it seemed like it might stay open. Yet despite the bright emails and friendly messages, something else lingered just under the surface, a warp in the air around him that he couldn't touch, but could feel. At school, some classmates avoided his eyes, teachers nodded, but not with warmth, with caution. On social media, along with praise, there were still shadows, hateful reposts of the doctored video, anonymous accounts tagging him with slurs, comments questioning whether the performance was genuine or manipulated. One post even claimed the original performance had been overproduced for clout, as if talent and legitimacy were tied to filters, not truth. Isaiah left those messages unread. He didn't need to see them to know they existed. He felt them in locked doors, sideways glances, the creak of empty chairs, avoiding his presence. Fame had arrived, but with it the weight of visibility. His evenings became a blur of phone calls and rehearsals. Miss Calloway's flash drive had opened a door, but once the door was open, the real test began. Which voices had purpose, which had profit, which had vulnerability. He recorded demos in his bedroom at night, layering his vocals softly under acoustic guitar chords, listening back on headphones until the hiss of fear at the edges of each note quieted to a hum. He sent files to agencies, responded to messages from hopeful managers, and even agreed to a televised interview scheduled for a late-night youth show. It was supposed to be a soft spotlight, not the bright glare of social media, but something closer to honest conversation. He agreed, despite the whispers in his mind. Will they twist it? Will they expect more? Will they ask for more than he's ready to give? The day of the interview, the studio halls smelled of paper cups, burnt coffee, and fluorescent lights. Isaiah walked in dressed simply. Jeans, a clean t-shirt, hoodie loosely zipped, the uniform of someone who survived storms, not someone who expected to shine. The cameras rolled. The producer checked levels. The host chatted with him off-air, eyes kind but wary. When the mic went live, Isaiah's heart sharpened, not from fear anymore, but clarity. He wasn't the viral sensation. He was a voice, a person, a story, and he felt the weight of knowing both. The cameras captured him. Not the earlier boy with the cracked microphone, but someone polished by pain, steadied by survival. He answered questions about his life. The bus rides, the missing dinners, the hoodie damp from rain, the community center where he practiced alone. He spoke, not with bitterness, but with honesty, with humility, and with refusal to shrink. When asked how the doctored video had made him feel, he paused, his breathing steady. The studio lights softened around him, and even behind the lens, you could see the tremor in his posture, not of fear, but of remembrance. The host nodded, silent. The editing crew stayed quiet. Around the country, viewers leaned forward. That night, social media surged again, but this time in a different shape. The interview clip racked up millions of views within hours. People who had never watched high school talent shows or cared about web drama now shared his story. A black boy who rose, was knocked down, stood up again, and refused to hide. The comments flooded. Finally, a real story. This is what perseverance looks like. Give him a record deal, right now. And yes, a few hate-laden retweets too, mocking the sincerity, mocking the sweatshirt, mocking everything that couldn't be sold as a product. But those voices felt smaller now, distant. The spotlight had shifted. He was no longer only for entertainment, he was for truth. Yet even as opportunity knocked, the scars remained. At home, late at night, Isaiah sometimes lay awake, listening to the whine of passing cars, the hum of streetlights, the quiet in his mother's bedroom. He remembered the red paint smeared on their window, the mocking laughs in the hallway, the note in his locker, "Sing tomorrow and you'll regret it." Those memories didn't fade with fame, they only layered. He understood now that success didn't erase pain. It carried it louder. Then came a letter, thick, glossy, stamped with a famous label's emblem. It offered a contract, studio time, PR team, distribution network. They wanted to sign him. But there was a clause buried deep. They wanted control. Over image, over tone, over the songs he sang. Control over when he could speak publicly. Control over how much of his story he could tell. The offer glowed like gold in his hands. It felt like escape, but he didn't sign. Instead, he folded the contract carefully, placed it on his desk, and left it there. His mother found it days later, picked up the paper, then looked at him. His eyes met hers, quiet, resolved. She nodded, soft. She didn't ask why. She didn't have to. She believed him. In the weeks that followed, a small grassroots label, run by a former choir teacher turned indie producer, reached out. They didn't offer contracts. They offered collaboration, freedom, respect, space. They listened to his demos. They heard the honesty. They didn't ask for alteration. They asked for roots, for real, for pain, for protest. He accepted, without hesitation. The contract was modest, no glitz, no promise of fame, just a promise that his voice would stay his own. The first studio session was in a rented basement with exposed pipes and cracked plaster. The walls smelled of damp wood and stubborn hope. He sat at the old piano, fingers on keys that had never known his story. The producer hit record, and then, quietly, he sang. Not for charts, not for applause, for truth, for healing. Each note shook the pipes. Each silence after the chords held more meaning than any auto-tune or glossy production ever could. And in that dimly lit room, away from flashing cameras and judgment, Isaiah felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Home. Around him, the world kept turning. Headlines appeared. Teen singers triumph amid backlash. From mockery to melody, Isaiah McClendon's rise. Social media campaigns formed. Hashtags trended. Community concerts were scheduled. Flyers pinned with his face. Not sensationalized, but real. Announced open mic nights at neighborhood centers. College showcases. Church recitals. Invitations poured in from music schools. Scholarships offered. Mentors reached out. Doors cracked open, some wide, some just a slit. And Isaiah walked through them with cautious steps. Weight of history in one hand, hope in the other. But everywhere he turned, even in the light, shadows followed. A parent at a concert paused mid-applause when a tweet bearing a hateful comment flashed on the venue screen. A classmate greeted him with a smile, but it flickered when they realized no one else noticed. The old habit of looking away still alive. When he signed his first modest contract with the indie label, a hidden account posted old footage side by side, the viral audition next to the doctored anthem video. Now framed as proof he was always problematic, not proof of his talent. The comments reawakened old fear. The weight of history pressed again. One night, walking home under a street lamp's orange glow, Isaiah stopped at a corner near the community center. He remembered the smell of rain the night he first walked into the audition room. He remembered the laughter, the stares, the doubt. He closed his eyes, took a breath, held it, exhaled. In the quiet, he heard nothing but the pulse of his own heartbeat. Then the hum of distant tires, life going on, people living, moving, fearing, dreaming. He realized then that all of it had never been about proving them wrong. It was about proving himself right. Not just as a singer, as a human, as someone who deserved a voice, who claimed a space, who reclaimed dignity. The night of his first public show after the deal was small, a community hall packed with faces like his own, people who had watched the story, people who believed in reclamation. As he stepped on stage, soft lights illuminating the cracked floorboards, he saw hope in the eyes of every person leaning forward. He didn't need applause anymore. He needed connection, and he got it. The cheers were loud, but not empty. They were steady. They were real. They were his. Then came the interview. The one that would air on national television. The cameras flashed again. The producers leaned forward. The host asked Tin the question everyone wanted to hear. What would you say to the boy who laughed at you the night of your audition? To the one who posted the mocking video? The question hung in the air, heavy with expectation, charged by memory, sharpened by consequences. Isaiah paused. The studio lights glared. The world leaned in. The moment hung on the edge of a breath. He looked into the lens, not with anger, not with denial, but with calm. And what he said next stunned everyone who heard it. If you believe voices like Isaiah's deserve to be heard, not silenced, type yes in the comments. Have you ever seen talent overlooked because of race or background? Share your story below. Don't forget to subscribe, because these stories aren't just entertainment. They're a fight for truth, dignity, and justice. We all need to keep alive.